afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me. A great conference. Right, so thanks to the University of Durham and the Center to have the United Nations Development Program here. As noted, I'm Kishan Khoday. I'm the representative of the United Nations Development Program in the Western Caribbean, covering a number of countries, as noted, such as Jamaica, Belize, Bahamas, Bermuda, and others. And of course, United Nations Development Program, as many of you know, we're very much focusing on the local implementation of global treaties, multilateral environmental agreements. For the past 30 years, UNDP has supported local action on the global environment agenda, building local capacities for things like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and of course, numerous other MEAs that are out there. In recent years, of course, a significant role also in helping countries develop their national climate plans, the NDCs, their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, the NDCEPs, and other local instruments to help achieve this goal of local action under MEAs. At the same time, we're very much a lead entity within the UN system in terms of capacity building on governance, on things like access to justice, on things like legislative reform, regulatory innovations. And so this also is a critical role of the United Nations in terms of taking forward some of these principles of international law, some of these norms, some of these requirements under MEAs at the local level, and moving the needle and advancing the ball on collective achievement of these global goals, and of course, all the interdisciplinary benefits, the cross co-benefits that are achieved from MEA results for things like poverty reduction, gender equality, conflict prevention, and other important goals. The advisory opinion that we're all, of course, very much looking forward to, over the next year or more from the ICJ on state responsibility for climate change. A momentous, historic decision in front of us, of course, with a record number of submissions already being made this year, as was just noted earlier. A number of key issues, of course, that are very much in focus that we'll be looking forward to hearing more advice from on things like historic responsibility for climate change, on things like state responsibility for climate change and environmental protection in situations of war, situations of conflict. Indeed, the rights of ecosystems, or the need to protect ecosystems as an entity, as was mentioned earlier, the important part of the precautionary principle and the do no harm for ecosystems in and of itself, of course, connected to the role of states. And indeed, the responsibilities that are connected also from climate action towards other goals such as poverty reduction, inequality, displacement. So these points, these important issues that are in front of us in terms of the topic of climate justice are very much at the core of what UNDP's mandate is about. Climate justice, climate action is really at the core of what we do in a very much an interdisciplinary way, as is the theme of the conference, and so connecting to the broader sustainable development agenda. So as was mentioned, I represent the UNDP in some of the most climate vulnerable spots in the world. As we know, the advisory opinion, as many global judicial processes, is very much driven by the small island development states, the SIDS. And so our support to SIDS for local action and capacity development, including in international processes, is very much part of our role. The recent SIDS conference that was hosted in the Caribbean laid out a new 10-year action plan, which brings these issues front and center. The state of the challenge for the most climate vulnerable countries and communities around the world, the SIDS. As noted by the UN Secretary General, the Caribbean is ground zero for the climate emergency in many ways. From 1970 to 2020, for example, SIDS globally lost $150 billion from climate-induced disasters. Climate change loss and damage today impacts about 5% of the GDP of states in the Caribbean. But by the end of the century, by the latter part of the century, that could rise to 20% of GDP in terms of loss and damage from climate change. Of course, this is average for all the 20 plus countries and territories in the Caribbean. There are hotspots, of course, where that average bumps up. So if we see the past big hurricane, Dorian, a few years ago, about 5 years ago, the Bahamas, for example, one of the lower lying countries in the world, lost more than 1/3 of its GDP just from that one climate event. So by the latter half of the century, up to $22 billion a year is expected in terms of losses. 10 million people have been faced with rural to urban displacement over the last 20 years. More than 10,000 species are at risk of habitat loss and local extinction, again, in the Caribbean. The boiling oceans, as we've heard, has made itself very visible this year more than ever before with Beryl, the Hurricane Beryl, which was the fastest Category 5 in recorded history, the earliest in the year, meaning 90% of corals face significant risk of disappearing at 2 degrees Celsius. So there's a risk to that particularly important ecosystem, which is vital for communities across the Caribbean. The CCA, the climate adaptation needs under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, the needs are about $100 billion in the Caribbean. But to date, only about $1 billion of grants have actually reached the Caribbean, often because of their upper middle income status of many of the Caribbean nations. So there is a need to shift norms of international cooperation in terms of the needs of fragile and vulnerable upper middle income countries, such as the SIDS, of course, rather than exacerbating debt burdens, which has been a serious crisis in itself for SIDS. So climate justice is very much front and center, I would say, in the new 10-year action plan that came out of the SIDS conference, in particular, common but differentiated responsibilities, of course. The Caribbean has been a vocal actor on reparations for past harms during the colonial era. In recent years, this has surged, this strong voice on this topic, regional commission and strong global advocacy, but also historic responsibility for the past generation of today's climate emergency. So calls for decolonial frameworks of resilience. This was aptly identified, quite well identified, in the recent Special Rapporteur report on the right to development and specifically the impacts of climate change loss and damage, with climate change and loss and damage, as he mentions, impacting many fundamental freedoms around the right to food, the right to water, self-determination, territorial integrity, the very existence of countries and parts of countries. And he lays out there the pillar of climate justice on remediation, including specific principles such as reparations, compensation, rehabilitation, and this need to address the weight of history if we were to achieve real climate justice in the future and today. So the Caribbean is very much in the eye of the storm on climate justice, and along with other SIDS, very much center stage when it comes to the advisory opinion on state responsibility for climate change. It's been, of course, front and center in terms of colonial era harm in the past, and this has really been, in a way, generation of much of the fragility that we see in countries around the world, of course, but in particular in the Caribbean, which is one of the most intensive spots for the overall transformation of landscapes, ecosystems, and communities, of course. So this resilience is in many ways in the spirit of resistance and towards a view to a better global order based on fairness and equality in international law and development. There's a sense of a deferred post-colonial defiance, I would say. This is also, as we know, in the last UN FCCC IPCC report, the sixth report, AR6, of course, the links to historical responsibility and the decolonial process and the colonial era was also highlighted there, in addition to the recent Special Rapporteur report and many other reports. So it is an increased attention to this topic of historical responsibility. Many academic studies, of course, show that more than half of all the climate change in the atmosphere today was indeed generated from the 18th to 20th century by the advanced industrial countries of the West. So there's specific data that's coming out of the academic community, and this is a really important role, of course, in terms of think tanks and universities in terms of analyzing the actual data on historical responsibility. There, of course, are issues with this, as we know, in terms of attribution, in terms of causation, but also indeed in terms of allocation of any kind of support coming out of historical responsibility to victims of climate impact. So these are really key for elucidation in advice to come on state responsibility. So the bottom line really is that there's a vast need to scale up assistance from developing countries, particularly to the most vulnerable SIDS, on things like climate adaptation, and indeed, as we know now from recent COPs, on loss and damage, for current and future loss and damage. But indeed, I think there's an important voice from the Caribbean and other SIDS on historic responsibility. So in conclusion, what action can come from the further advancements on the topic of state responsibility for climate change? So the role of UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, as I mentioned, particularly on local action, as the UN platform really locally for achieving the goals under the Paris Agreement, the Global Biodiversity Framework, early action on the new High Seas Treaty and the biodiversity protection there under, of course, on the SDGs more generally. Today, UNDP implements over $4 billion US of grants in over 140 countries on things like climate strategies and policy, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, obviously the links in particular as a development agency, the links to poverty reduction, gender, other MEAs such as biodiversity. And so this interdisciplinarity to achieve climate justice is really, again, at the core of what we do. In some ways, I would say over the last more than 60 years of UNDP's existence and practice at the country level, having local presence over 50 years in the Caribbean, for example, we're very much in a way an actor and platform for CBDR in a way. So the alignment and advancing that challenge of climate change as a common concern of humanity, of course, but also that need for technical assistance, collaboration between North and South through these technical assistance capacity development initiatives. So channeling that assistance to developing countries has been obviously a very important thing in terms of advancing achievements under the MEAs in recent decades. Now, scaling up that kind of role and supporting action on this climate crisis through things like climate resilient food systems, climate resilient water systems, infrastructure, livelihoods, and future-proofing poverty gains that countries have achieved over the last decades. Community empowerment, the capacities for loss and damage, better analyses locally of loss and damage impacts locally, that there's a big capacity development to be done there for that. And of course, a big role that we're playing at the moment and going forward in terms of enhancing NDC implementation through climate finance strategies, both short-term under NDCs as well as long-term climate finance strategies, biodiversity finance. So we have initiatives around the world in over 100 countries on these topics, trying to really set out the framework for what's the local base, NDCs as a sovereign investment plan, as it were, to really serve as a base for that scaled up assistance to vulnerable countries in the developing world. So the state capacity for responsibility, of course, very much focusing on both developed and developing countries. Historic responsibility is a key issue for many industrialized countries, but also there's a need for looking at capacity development for achieving climate responsibility in developing countries as well. And so we play a role also in terms of establishing climate agencies, for example. So we've played an important role over the years in establishing national climate agencies at the country level in developing countries. Climate laws and policies, things like renewable energy legislation, or integrating climate resilience into things like legislation, laws on agriculture or water. And indeed rethinking the overall development policy framework to better account for risk-informed development. A very key role is really on governance, as I mentioned at the onset. And so we have extensive cooperation at the country level in the local capacities for aligning with international legal principles, including on climate change. Things like access to justice initiatives, right? Working with the judiciaries. We work with Supreme Courts around the world, with local courts around the world. And therefore using that kind of capacity in those bases for advancing climate justice locally, building on these global principles, but taking action locally. And we've seen a number of success stories, as we know, around the world emerging, whether it's climate litigation or more generally from the climate social movements for climate change and how that affects national policy at the local level. Working with parliaments as well, as I said, on legislation, oversight of agencies' roles and duties under climate change, in some cases supporting climate provisions into constitutions. And so it's about enhancing capacity at the systemic level, at the policy legal level, but also at the institutional level and indeed at the community level. Localized courts, supporting that emergence of innovative jurisprudence from across the South on issues like climate justice and state responsibility, and addressing both the global challenge of climate change, but also this evolving context locally. How do we really address this in an interdisciplinary, but build that state capacity, and indeed support our partners, in particular in SIDS and across the Caribbean, in advancing issues like loss and damage, and indeed historic responsibility. Thank you very much.